Steve, how are you?
Good, Eli. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for taking some time to chat with us.
Yeah, I'm excited
Um,
about it.
awesome. Why don't you just start a little bit and tell us a little bit about your background, your career? I know you've kind of gone on this interesting journey from tech to media, and sort of how you ended up from there to where you are now as the publisher of the Star Tribune.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I'm coming to you from the Minnesota Star Tribune here in downtown Minneapolis, which is where I am today, our CEO and publisher. But I did not come from a newspaper background and never thought I'd be a newspaper publisher, if I'm totally honest with you. This was not kind of on my career radar, but I'm very happy to be at a pretty unique time for journalism. I guess backing up, I did grow up in Minnesota, so I have Minnesota roots, but always wanted to leave. Always thought I'd eject from Minnesota at some point and go explore new things in the world, and didn't know that I'd ever come back. And ended up spending most of my career in technology. I got a job at YouTube in the early days of that platform, back when viral video was just starting to come about as this new phenomenon in news and politics. There was a moment way back in the 2006 midterm elections when a senator named George Allen was captured on video in rural Virginia using a racial slur. You might remember it. That ended up
Yeah.
losing him his Senate seat in Virginia, losing the entire Senate from the right to the left, and sort of YouTube politics was born based on this one viral video that today seems, kind of standard for the form, but back then was a totally new phenomenon. So I came on board YouTube in the early days to help them figure out their news and political operation. That launched a career in tech for me, first at YouTube, then at Google. And I really enjoyed Silicon Valley, enjoyed my time in tech. It was kind of the utopic era of the internet, if you will, back when all we thought was going to happen from the web was goodness. It's just like, oh, we all have access to power and content is a meritocracy, and we've democratized, all aspects of engaging with power. And many of those things are true, but of course, the dark side of the web came pretty clear pretty quickly to many of us who are there, and is today part of the conversation I think we're all grappling with. And a big piece of it was what happened to media. So anyway, I kind of made a life decision. My wife and I met at Google. We had twins. We decided to kind of reinvent our lives and move to the Midwest. Again, I never thought I'd come back, but 20 years later, we thought maybe we want to raise our kids in Minnesota. So we left the Valley, came here to Minneapolis. I then left tech and went into government for 4 years as our governor's deed commissioner. That is essentially the jobs commissioner for our state here in Minnesota that focuses on workforce development, economic development, things you talk about a lot at Hard Reset. And that is the subject of a book that I just have that came out called How I Found Myself in the Midwest, which we can talk about if relevant here. But I would say ultimately kind of reaffirmed my belief in the power of going local to make change. And, when you see how media has been so disrupted by the industry that I really came up in, local news is an area that I think deserves some of the most attention for a whole host of reasons. And so when the opportunity came here to help reinvent the Strib, as we call it locally, it was a chance really to, with some investment from our owner and a whole new leadership team, try to really kind of save the institution and build it into a modern digital media company. And that's kind of the journey we're on. So that's it in a nutshell. Lots of details in between, but it's a pleasure to
Yeah,
talk to you about some of it.
totally. How's that journey to reinvent the Tribune going? Are you guys kind of reimagining things, or how do you balance sort of just doing things as they've always been done, the kind of classic traditional journalism way, with trying to sort of compete and get attention in the new sort of digital media economy?
Yeah. It's coming along. We've got a great team. I'm about 2.5 years into it, and we've changed a lot already. We already have more digital subscriptions than print, for example. But it's not just a matter of like, oh, isn't it just, let's take the news that was once printed on paper and turn it into pixels. It's a whole new way of operating a company. And to your point, I think journalism necessarily has a culture around it of, everything must be a polished pearl before it is released. It can be kind of a cautious culture. That's good in the sense that you want a high quality bar and you can't be just throwing out, conjecture. You have to ensure your facts are checked. But also when you're trying to change the culture of a company to be more digital and more innovative and faster moving, you have to kind of be willing to try new formats, try new mediums, try new ways to connect with audiences, and frankly, try new business models to generate the funding required to fund what in our case is the largest newsroom in the entire Midwest, believe it or not, over 220 journalists. So we're on our way. Lots of new business models we've generated, lots of new
Yeah,
strategies.
I was kind of curious about that because I've sort of lived through a lot of this, working in newspapers my whole career, from the New York Times to the Washington Post to working in NBC News, and I've sort of seen the attempts to reinvent ourselves, attempts to do video more, do audio more, do short pieces, do long form. It sort of sometimes feels like, from having worked in this, that almost everything has sort of been tried. To monetize events, obviously, is a big part of how some media organizations are getting revenue. Subscription, there was a big subscription boom. Now it looks like some places are moving away from that again. Obviously, that's an important part probably for a local newspaper. But like, what does innovation look like for you guys? What are some things that have worked, and how does that look from your seat?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would operate from the premise to begin with that there's no silver bullet. Many of the things you just mentioned should be done and should be done well and have to be executed on really effectively. It's not necessarily all the ideas that have to be perfect, but the execution has to be really strong. And I think in general, the orientation has to be more innovative and forward-leading. I think news organizations kind of missed the internet, broadly speaking, and certainly are in danger of missing AI if we don't lean in more heavily there. So I think we're trying to kind of do a lot of things at once. On the one hand, trying to retain print subscribers to fund our future while trying new things on the digital side. But it's not just, hey, wouldn't a podcast be better, or wouldn't video work more nicely and what have you. It's, I think, more fundamental than that. I have found news organizations tend to be organizations oriented around primarily quality and less audience. There was a time when news organizations were like the power of the people, right? But it was all paper. You didn't quite get data back from them, but there was sort of a monopoly in place. Today, we have to be far more audience-centric if we're going to get things right. It doesn't mean just going to the lowest common denominator of what gets the most clicks, but it's engaging audiences where they're at and engaging them with things that they desperately need and think are worth paying for. That's the big thing. Like, you can get a lot of free news out there. News can find you if you want it to, but to convince them they have to pay for it, you have to really deliver a value proposition, and to do that, you have to know what they want. And so this idea of just being this kind of broad, place-based publication that one might subscribe to because if they feel civically responsible to do so, I think we need to, yes, lean into our brand and lean into our local pride and all of it, but also be quite targeted. Choose categories where we think we can really grow more deeply. High school sports, for example, when we go deep there, we can get a lot of subscribers who want to see their kid in the paper, who want to engage more deeply with that particular area, and they'll subscribe to the entire bundle just for that one reason. I'd say it's similar for everything from mountain biking to cooking to what have you. We're trying to pull off this trick of both being this kind of Minnesota institution, but also quite targeted. And you can apply that to a whole host of innovations. But that big mind shift towards audience and away from simply quality is something that, tech companies kind of get intuitively. That's how I was brought up at Google. But I found news organizations don't always lean towards because of the, traditions of journalism, which are important and powerful. And part of connecting with audiences is trust and investigative reporting that really drives, value. But you got to be targeted too.
I think, yeah, and I think, you've probably run into this. I certainly did in my career, that sometimes it feels like, I've worked for in local news for years in New York and then a little bit out here in the Bay Area, that tension between serving your local community versus going big, that can also be a contradiction. And I think that's the quandary that tech companies haven't had to navigate, because they've just gone big and now they're going even bigger, and like scale is just this huge buzzword and obviously has been a part of how the industry has operated. But I remember as a local reporter for a little paper in Brooklyn, like I had a couple million page view stories back in 2011. These were big viral hits that I worked hard on, and like was grateful to have the readers for that, but you couldn't sort of create that. You couldn't predict it. It was sort of like catching a really rare fish out there that would happen sometimes. But when you're doing the work you should be doing, just sort of covering community boards, local policies, zoning issues, stuff like that, those stories aren't going to get anything close to that kind of traffic. So how do you sort of both serve your local community while also like getting quote unquote audience? Is it just figuring out how to get bigger audience where you're at? Or are you also trying to sort of capture some of that lightning in a bottle, which is like these big, massive audiences out there beyond, Minneapolis, beyond Minnesota, stuff like that?
No, that's a great question. I mean, impressive, by the way, to get several million sessions at any story for you back in 2011. I would say today, hopefully we have better data than we had back then and can try to get a little bit more pattern recognition on what kinds of things are going to click. But it's also an artistic endeavor. You never fully know until it's out there what's going to really fly. I think we do look a lot at the data, what converts people to subscribe. We have tried to detach ourselves from feeling like we have to be the paper of record and be at every single legislative hearing of every single body and A, we can't. And B, to your point, a lot of this stuff does not take off. And so we have to be more relevant. Now, that doesn't mean not doing journalism, but we have to be able to find the needle in the haystack of stories that are the most important and not feel like it's our job just to sort of show up, if you will. And so that's been a pretty big shift for us as an institution. It's a necessary one. It's not that we don't wish there were a human being at every single public meeting, for example, because sometimes that's where you discover stories. But with data and transcripts and AI and all of it, you can find other ways to sort of sift through existing public data to find the gems that are out there. But ultimately, that comes back to for us anyway, as a for-profit media institution, what's going to convert someone to subscribe? And we look at all the data that helps someone get to that place. The good news is it's not just cat videos. In fact, it's very rarely the stuff that's like light and sort of cheap, because that stuff you can get anywhere. It's more often the deep investigative story or the really quality restaurant review or the hyper-local piece that really can change a community that is what converts people. We have to do that at scale. And that's the challenge, and I think that's what everyone's trying to figure out with decreasing numbers of journalists in this country. 75% fewer journalists in the last decade than were here 10 years ago. It's just, to scale from a boots on the ground standpoint, it's just harder with less folks doing the work. And that's where I think the business model innovation has to come in on new ways to try to bring money in the door. And yeah, a lot's been tried, but there's a lot more we can try and need to try.
I want to talk a little bit about your career in tech, because you didn't just work in tech, as you pointed out. You worked in tech in a way that I think has a lot of adjacencies to journalism and traditional media, whether it's doing politics at YouTube or working at Google, the Google News Lab. Let's talk a little bit about what the view of the news is on that side. There's been a lot of criticism of the relationship between tech companies and media, and I think the sort of unbalanced relationship and how much power tech companies have and how much media companies wish they have lost to that. And certainly you can look at ad revenue directions going more to tech companies than media as part of that. What do you think critics of big tech, let's start this place. Like, what do you think they get wrong about how a company like Google looks at the news? Because I know a lot of publishers, I've heard the grumblings. I've been quite critical of the relationship between the news business and Google. But what do you think those critics get wrong?
Well, I can speak for the Google that I spent a lot of my career at, and there's a lot Google got wrong, a lot we got wrong, a lot me and my teams got wrong trying to figure this thing out, both at YouTube and Google. I would say that culturally, Google is a place that I think, again, I can speak for when I was there, had its heart in the right place of wanting to elevate and help people find quality information. I mean, at the core of Google's mission is, to organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful. That does not feel too dissonant with journalism. But let's face it, the ad market that Google gobbled up like that when it reinvented search advertising and suddenly, the monopoly that newspapers had on this medium just vanished, has fundamentally disrupted journalism, made it more challenging. So I think people might think that Google doesn't care. My sense was that Google did care and was trying new things to do, but frankly didn't quite know how to do them. And sometimes the technology moves faster than the ability of those who created it to really mitigate any of its side effects. And so ultimately Google's a for-profit company trying to win at the end of the day. And so, like, I went to Google I/O this year, and there was not much placation of publishers at a moment when AI is taking things over, because Google has to win the future and feels now very much competitive with OpenAI in ways that, they're ultimately beholden to their shareholders. So I think people sometimes get wrong that not all these tech companies are created equal. There are some whose kind of DNA might line them up better to help news organizations, but none of that's inevitable going forward. And, I think the solutions are sometimes more challenging. Now, I'd say also, people in the Valley don't always get publishing. They don't always get news. It's hard to find someone who works at Google who really understands kind of the struggles of a publisher. And oftentimes those people aren't the people who are making the most important decisions at the company. So that's a challenge. I think while the DNA may be some ways in the right place, in practice, there haven't been a lot of huge solutions that have come out of these places that feel much different from charity when it comes to reinventing the business model.
Yeah, and I mean, you're sort of talking, what I hear you sort of saying a little bit is there's a system, Google's a part of a system, it's got to compete, it's got to maximize stuff for shareholders and all that, and therefore it's going to act a certain way. But I guess the question is, looking at things now, for example, I mean, I'm remember during the Google News era, I worked on a team at the Washington Post that was very intent. It was an audience team, and one of our, this was, I don't know how long this trend lasted for, but in the attempts to sort of capture digital audiences, one of the phases was, really trying to plug stuff on Google News. So if there was a slot in the Google News section, politics, business, that we didn't have our story, even if 8 other places had on this team, they wanted us to get ours up because the Washington Post had a really high, sort of ranking in Google News, and therefore could potentially get one of those top slots. But there was always grumbling also about, our positioning. I think on the back end, and this was way above my head in terms of how the sort of ad revenue stuff shook out. And, now that stuff is getting even worse with AI, right? It's like you're not even getting your 1 out of every 40 clicks to your story. The information is just getting fully synthesized into this AI summary at the top of search. And I know this is after your time at the company. What are some, like, having worked at Google and sort of been a part of some of this, having worked in traditional newspaper publishing now, what are some solutions you see to, sort of bridging the gap between these kind of winner-take-all system that has benefited big tech and the content producers, the people who have to go to those meetings and do the work and write the story, which is time-consuming and expensive? What are some solutions there in terms of helping the traditional media business model?
Yeah. Well, I am worried about Google Zero, if you will, this date at which suddenly there's the traffic that we get from Google, approaches a very small number and perhaps zero. We all have to be kind of paranoid about that moment. I guess I'll say, comparing that to any other platform on the web today, the company that most often reaches out to publishers to try to figure this out is Google. I get far more calls from them. Yes, I used to work there, so that's maybe part of it, but from them than I do from other major companies. So I think they are trying to grapple with it. I guess at the one level, we have to figure out the business model for AI that somehow pays the most quality content creators for their content in a meaningful way, whether that's a licensing agreement, whether that's a flat fee, whether that's some other model that's out there. These are the discussions that are happening in Washington and elsewhere, and I think are really important. What tech companies will tell you is, well, we that sounds good. We want to be able to do that, but just so you know, and they're just honest about this, we don't really need your content to have effective AI algorithms. The content within journalism is a drop in the bucket to the massive amount of content on the web. And while it is the highest quality content out there, what I've heard a lot of technology people say, and I'm not just pinpointing Google here, but just broadly, is that it really is kind of charity, because at a meaningful level, it doesn't contribute directly to the answers that their AI bots are able to generate. So I don't know if that's true or not. I'll just say that's kind of one of the things that you hear. At the same time,
what do you think about that? Do you think that's true?
Well, technically, whether it's true or not, I guess I don't know, because I'm not inside of their algorithm. But I would struggle to imagine that the whole thing fits together and works if there isn't also quality content on the web that you can trust. The broader ecosystem demands that you have authoritative sources of information that people can lean on. Otherwise, the whole trust in the system starts to crumble. So the macro view has to be, you need the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Minnesota Star Tribune, and many others who are trusted and actually do boots in the ground reporting, or the whole system kind of falls apart, right? And I think already you're seeing perceptions of the slop on the internet, changing, people's views of the quality of some of these algorithms. But I would say more broadly, to your point on the answer, yes, we need an answer on how we get our content licensed and paid for in these algorithms, full stop. You have to be able to be paid for these pieces, and there's no model there yet. But more broadly, I guess if I have to, look into the future, hard to imagine we don't have a pretty significant shift in the business model for journalism that goes beyond just the tech companies if we're going to survive as an industry. And there, I think, philanthropy is something we've really leaned into heavily. We're asking for donations. That's sort of a new revenue model. But I can't imagine a world in which, if journalism is a civic good in the same way that broadband or healthcare or any number of other civic goods that we engage government funding for, we're going to need government money to save journalism. And this trend that we've seen over the past few months of dollars being pulled from NPR and PBS seem to be going in the wrong direction, broadly speaking. But I'd say, especially when it comes to hyper-local and local like us, you're going to need some degree of government funding to play a significant part in the business model if we want it to operate at scale. I just don't see it happening with subscription.
Let's look at a recent effort to that. I'm curious if you followed the effort in California, the bill that was eventually scrapped to tax some of the ad revenue that companies like Google get, I guess through their news products, and give that over to local news organizations. It would have been hundreds of millions of dollars, and then it was eventually scuttled here after pretty aggressive pushback from Google, including, I think at one point they temporarily removed all links to California news websites from their Google News search to sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, protest or throw a little toddler tantrum about what such a bill could do to them. Did you follow that effort, and would you support a similar effort like that in Minnesota?
I did follow it generally. I didn't follow it specifically. I know that ultimately what was passed was some funding that went into more of a grant-like structure and some things like that. But yes, watered down for sure. I would say broadly, I do support efforts that find market-driven solutions to this that, yes, might come in the flavor of tax, either tax credits or tax incentives, or sorry, spending incentives. For example, like hire a journalist and get tax-free labor for a year on that hiring. There's other interesting models where advertisers are incentivized to advertise the local news because they get a sort of a discount with it at the end of the year. So I think there have to be models that like match market behavior a little bit more. Whether they're precisely the one that was scuttled in California, I don't know, but it sounds like, in general, those directions of finding a way to match it with an incentive that both the news organization is incentivized to do a stronger job and others around it are incentivized feels right to me. If it's just take a pound of flesh from tech and hand it over to media, I just feel like media is always going to lose those battles in a practical sense, and Google's always going to push back, or others like it, because there is a sort of fundamental economics of the internet that they are concerned about that get disrupted, would be their perspective. But I'd say you're going to do something radical to save this, and it's not just going to be one company. It's going to be the whole ecosystem of the internet has to have something that works for news organizations, and I think it has to have some degree of, market-driven incentives the government helps guide if we're gonna save it. Otherwise, don't get me wrong, we're doing all kinds of things to grow our subscriptions and get philanthropy and hold events and do cause marketing, and we're figuring out a whole new host of things we're excited about. But the whole kind of thing is teetering on this foundation that's itself pretty shaky right now.
I kind of want to slightly change the topic a little bit and sort of talk about just kind of what it means to be in journalism in news publishing in 2025. I mean, things are very intense out there. I mean, this is a very poignant moment, obviously coming after Charlie Kirk's assassination. A lot of discussion about the sort of political climate in this country, what free speech is, what it isn't. What are the limits that it's running up against in this country? So this is all to sort of set the scene for asking you a question that's sort of a classic journalistic question, which is this idea of objectivity. Do you believe in objectivity, and what does it mean to you as a newspaper publisher? Because a lot of people are making arguments that it isn't real or doesn't need to exist.
Well, I certainly believe in the philosophical concept of objectivity. I mean, there are facts out there. And I think the minute we think there are not facts out there, we're in trouble. I also think that people do want to know the truth. I don't think we woke up one day and suddenly everybody said, I don't want to find quality journalistic content. I think there's a demand for it. I think the internet has fragmented the sources from which we get it, and trust in institutions has fallen so rapidly, media included, across so many vectors of our society that it's just harder to deliver. Is journalism, an objective art? I think there's objectivity at the core of what we try to do at the Minnesota Star Tribune. All kinds of selective decisions get made into what a journalist does any given day, as you know well, like the story topic you choose, the words you choose for your headline. There's art and science to all of it. But journalists are well trained in this art of, how you give a source and a topic its fair due, and the basic fundamental tenets of journalism that, for me, even as a new newspaper publisher, I've gotten to learn from a newsroom after having come into this organization with fresh eyes. So I don't think that objectivity is dead, or that we can't find the truth, or that facts are all through the lens of whatever political view you have today. But I think it's a heck of a lot harder given the ecosystem that we're in. And I think that, nothing's changed about the art of journalism in the sense of it is, a pursuit of the truth through, investigation and rigor and, some core practices of the art. But I think, unfortunately, right now, everyone's understanding of some of those guidelines is starting to fall apart. And even such simple things as what's an opinion piece versus what's a reported piece have started to just sort of fall away in the public's consciousness. And we've started to lose trust in it. And once you lose that trust, you're in danger. I think in local, it's a little bit stronger. People kind of tend to put more faith in their local news institutions than, say, the larger national ones. There tends to be a little bit less polarization. But I'd be lying if I didn't say there's certainly polarization here in Minnesota, too. I mean, there are conservative outlets who want nothing less than for the Minnesota Star Tribune to fail. They may depend on the ecosystem that we create with the number of journalists that we have here, but it's competitive, and it can get more political than I think it should be. So the way we look at the newsroom is we continually bring in experts to come in and advise and train and remind our journalists, almost just like professional maintenance along the way on these topics, because it's a challenging time to do the work.
So I think everyone would agree, like you said, that fact-based reporting is critical and that that's the role of the media. And obviously that's under huge threat from just the deluge of information from, people online, whether they're right sometimes or never or what. So that's one thing. And yes, I think we can agree, but also understand that there's some issues with that are big and systemic. But the second thing that I think I want to drill down is this idea of maybe not, and fairness is another thing I think everyone wants, whether you're on the right or the left, or, you want things like, because even within these little political bubbles, there's a lot of degrees of distinction, there's a lot of disagreement, all those things. But let's talk about neutrality maybe, because I think sometimes that idea of objectivity gets mixed up with this idea of neutrality, or maybe they are similar, and I want to get to sort of hearing how you think about this. But, we're getting to a world where everything is kind of, and this wasn't the world that I started out in journalism, but where we're kind of ending it, everything is up for debate all of a sudden politically in the halls of power, whether it's democracy itself, whether it's, who gets to exercise certain types of speech and when and why, whether it's who is going to be at the wrong end of state-sponsored violence and enforcement. What happens as this goes further and further, and there's actual policies, whether it's in a state legislature, whether it's in Washington, it's going to be both, that are advocating for curtailing certain rights, that are advocating for or will result in violence against certain groups of people. I've always wondered is, as this sort of like, if it feels like the American experiment is getting degraded, is the role of the journalist just to sit there with their note book and take notes about how, or is there some point where there is a point of view that a traditional reporter is bringing and saying there are things we believe in, and there isn't just like, this isn't really, these issues aren't really up for debate, even though people are debating them? Yeah.
Well, that's a big question. I think I share a lot of the concerns that are behind your question, for sure. I think that it is a fraught time in media, and I do think that it is a job of journalists certainly to hold a mirror to society and report the news. Like, that has to be the case. Journalism is not generally seen as a profession of advocacy, at least on our news pages. The whole premise is on if people know what's happening and can draw lines and connect dots and understand the challenges that are happening on any number of vectors of our society, that itself will contribute to the broader dynamic of what's at play. But I think the role of civic leaders and politicians and advocacy groups and what have you is very different from journalism. One of the things that we've seen on a whole host of issues in the philanthropy space in particular is a lot of funders now are funding journalism because they just think we need more information about a topic for the flywheel of change to happen. So take the climate crisis, for example. If there's not enough reporting on what's happening in the field of climate, then there's just fewer people that are aware of what's happening and can engage in useful ways. So it's not that journalism needs to do sort of pro-climate change organization journalism, but it has to at least lift up the issue and help people grapple with it in a way that it is a common set of facts we can rely on. Now, I know you're not asking about climate, but I'm just picking that as an issue where, journalism can play a role. Human beings are fundamentally a storytelling species, right? It's how we've differentiated ourselves from others from forever. And I do think the stories we tell ourselves help us understand our moment, and journalism has to play a role there. Are there opinion pieces in the pages of journalism that do advocacy work? Yes. Are there editorial boards like ours who will take a stand on something like gun violence that, our state recently has been an extremely hot topic given the political assassinations and school shootings we've had here in a really horrific summer? Yes. But ultimately, I think the job of journalism is to report the facts, lift them up, help society see them, do the best dang job we can to make them prevalent and visible. And then, civic leaders take the baton from there and do with it what they will. I think that still has to be the model ultimately. And if you can't lose faith in that model working because it has some intuitive strength to it. But I do worry about it for the same reasons you do. It's so fragmented today. It's so harder to get your voice up and above. And I think, like, given some of the existential questions that you posed in your question, which, I don't know if I'm any more qualified to answer than anybody else, but I think it's a really important time for journalism to lift them up. And are there two sides to every story? I don't know. Maybe not every story. Some stories there's only one side, but it should be at least reported on and understood. And that's the job of journalism to get right.
Well, I mean, I think there's many sides to every story. There's more than two sides to every story, but it doesn't necessarily map always with the sort of political debate about it. And I think that's where sometimes newspapers run into.
I think that's what
we
I'm
have
saying.
this model that says left, right, yes, no, whatever. That's the sort of comfortable debate. This is how our policies and politics work. But sometimes the actual fact-based debate is not happening within that dichotomy, I guess you could say.
I think that's right. And there you're running up against forces that the internet has lifted up to change even how we think and interact with each other. The attention economy we live in makes it a lot harder to have some of these conversations in a more thoughtful way.
I got two more questions for you. One, I just want to ask about, we read a lot about AI at Hard Reset. It's obviously a major economic issue. It's interesting philosophically, and for those of us in the sort of reporting, writing, sort of business, it's very relevant as well. How are you guys looking at AI at the Star Tribune? Are you incorporating it? Any other ways you're engaging with it?
Yeah. Well, we're wearing two hats with this, maybe three or four, but at least two I'll mention here. One is to our earlier conversation on the business model questions. We need to be in Washington, in our state capital here in Minnesota, engaging with legislators and others on what the overall model for licensing and use of our content is going to be moving forward. And that is, I would say, largely a defensive posture, quite honestly. Like, it's trying to navigate this for our business model. It can be aggressive, but certainly there's a kind of like protect our content dynamic at play. On the other hand is the experimental hat, and trying to use this like every business is to achieve things in new and efficient ways. So we're using it a lot to make better sense of our archives and service them up in the right place to reach the right reader with the right archival content that we can. There are some tasks of journalism that are easily automatable without leading to robot reporting. Everything from note-taking to layout and what have you. That stuff's just, we'd be silly not to do. It just makes our jobs quicker and easier. And we should embrace that. But ultimately, we have to position ourselves as almost the anti-AI in a way. Like, we have human beings. They're out in the street. They have a notebook and a pencil, and they're actually watching the event. They are taking in information. You can trust them. And I think positioning-wise, we do not want to be in robot reporter territory. I don't think anybody does, although some have tried. I would say we want to differentiate ourselves while using AI in some ways that are really clearly defined and also playful. Like, we created a Minnesota State Fair food bot last month for the Minnesota State Fair that went through 158 years of Minnesota Star Tribune State Fair food coverage and helped people find what State Fair foods most match their interests. I mean, these are fun stuff. We'll use them in more serious ways too, but look, it's a little bit of experimentation, it's a little bit of business model innovation, and it's a little bit of defense and sort of licensure conversation. It's a lot for any organization to handle, but I think for journalism, it's kind of existential. We can't avoid it. And I think many news organizations, whether it was the advent of internet or of social media, kind of ignored these trends for too long at their peril. And I don't know a publisher today who's ignoring AI in any meaningful way. You have to be really leaning in.
I read a little bit in your book about, it's a story of coming home, right? To Minnesota, and I guess, I don't know if sort of away from tech and back to sort of local reporting is part of that, but you say that it's a story of hope, and I just wanted you to sort of talk about, maybe from your vantage as a local news publisher, from being back in your local community, what are the things that are encouraging you right now?
Yeah, I think we need some hope right now, and the book nor my own views are not Pollyannish in any way, but I would say that, Minnesota is a unique outlier in many cases. It's a unique state with a unique history. The book goes into a lot of that. But ultimately, I think the message to leave people with is that there's a lot of power when you go local. To our earlier conversation, if you look at all of the declining trust metrics in our country around where we're headed, and media certainly in that conversation around a declining lack of trust in media, the best shot we have at reinventing these institutions isn't what's happening in Washington with DOGE, in my opinion. It's what happens on the ground in local environments. There's more trust for it. Income outcomes are more tangible. There's less polarization at a local level. And in my journey of having left Google and gone into state government and now newspaper publishing, which you could certainly claim as a series of really poor career decisions, if looked at one way, has been, in my way, life much more meaningful in the sense that, the outcomes of what I do are very proximate. I think local has the best chance of reinventing our institutions into new directions. I think we need to find more ways to innovate inside of these institutions. But I give local a better shot than I give national when it comes to helping revitalize America for a new chapter. And that's what we're trying to do here at the Strib. I think there's all kinds of reasons to be hopeful.
You saying local news or just local everything?
Well, I mean, the two institutions I've left Google to join have been government and news. So I mean, in the book I go a lot into how we're trying to reinvent government in the face of crisis, the challenges and opportunities we've had there through both the COVID pandemic and beyond. And then in media, I think it's a different story, but it's similar just in the sense of, I think part of the reason that people have lost trust in institutions is institutions have not continually gained that trust by meeting modern demands with new efforts. And the culture around some of these really long-standing institutions is quite conservative. So trying to go into these, I guess has been the story of my last two career chapters, is trying to go into these more established institutions and help them reimagine how they serve their audience or customers or citizens is, I think, a worthwhile effort. And we're trying to figure it out here like we did in government, and hopefully we're making some progress.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Eli. Take care.
Cheers.
All right, man. Keep you posted on when you post it. Good questions. Those are some heady questions. I don't know if I made much progress with you, but I appreciate the dialogue anyway.
No, I appreciate you giving them a stab, and I'm sort of working this stuff out in my head. I actually kind of want to write about it a little bit, but appreciate it.
Yeah.
There's no right answers here.
Oh, yeah, no, they're good questions. I think philosophically, it's a heavy time, right? I mean, the Kirk assassination just has us all kind of reeling a little bit to what this all means for our democracy. So it's, I wish there were easy answers, but I think doing the work matters. So thanks for what you're doing. It makes a difference.
Cheers. Great to connect.
You too.
Bye-bye.